Reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to share the inheritance with me." He replied to him, "Friend, who appointed me as your judge and arbitrator?" Then he said to the crowd, "Take care to guard against all greed, for though one may be rich, one's life does not consist of possessions." Then he told them a parable. There was a rich man whose land produced a bountiful harvest. He asked himself, "What shall I do? For I do not have space to store my harvest." And he said, "This is what I shall do. I shall tear down my barns and build larger ones. There I shall store all my grain and other goods. And I shall say to myself, now as for you, you have so many good things stored up for many years. Rest, eat, drink, be merry." God said to him, "You fool, this night your life will be demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, to whom will they belong? Thus will it be for the one who stores up treasure for himself, but is not rich in what matters to God." The Gospel of the Lord. Today is the feast of St. Ignatius of Antioch. St. Ignatius of Antioch is a very significant saint in church history. He lived at the very end of the first century of the Christian era. Right? So he was the third bishop of Antioch. The first bishop of Antioch, does anybody know who the first bishop of Antioch was? It's actually St. Peter. Right? So St. Peter, as he was on his way to Rome, one of the places he stopped in was Antioch, and he founded a church there. So St. Ignatius of Antioch was a successor of St. Peter. He was a disciple of him and also of St. John the Evangelist. He died in the year 107 AD, and he was a martyr in the church. He's famous because on his way to be martyred, right, he was basically, the Roman Empire began to persecute Christians during his reign as bishop. And because he was so well known in the Christian world, they were trying to make a mockery of him. So basically, they would stop at every town along the way and basically show him off to the people. It kind of backfired to the Romans because St. Ignatius was an inspiration to all the Christians that he met. As he was on his way to Rome, for example, he actually wrote a letter to the Christians in Rome, and he begged them to not intercede or try to change what was happening because he truly longed to be a martyr for God. And eventually that is what happened. He was eventually fed to the wild beasts in the Colosseum. St. Ignatius is also significant because he was so early in church history. It is very interesting to read his writings because it gives us a very full picture of what the early church was like. So many people, especially modern Bible scholars and other people, right, they kind of have this impression that in the early church, everything was really simple. And it was just about, the preaching of the gospel. There was no church hierarchy and all these other things. And eventually the Catholic Church kind of added all of this complexity to everything. When you read St. Ignatius of Antioch, you see just how Catholic the early church was. As St. Ignatius of Antioch, for example, he put a huge emphasis on obedience to the local bishop. He basically said that priests who are not in union with their bishops are not real priests, and Christians who are not in union with their bishops are not real Christians. They are heretics. St. Ignatius also had a lot of things to say about the Blessed Virgin Mary that would resonate a lot with what we believe as Catholics. Some of the more striking things of St. Ignatius' theology is what he has to say about the Eucharist. And I actually pulled these up on my phone this morning. Just listen to how strong his belief in the Eucharist was. He said this in his letter to the Romans. He said, "I have no taste for corruptible food, nor the pleasures of this life, but rather I desire the bread of God, which is the flesh of Christ. And for drink I desire his blood." That was speaking about the Eucharist. Another thing he said about the Eucharist is he talked about some of the heretics in the early church, people who were already denying some of the basic truths of Christianity. And one of the things he said about the heretics, he said this. He said, "They abstain from the Eucharist and from prayer because they do not believe that the Eucharist is the flesh of our Savior Jesus Christ." Interesting. He was saying that even in his day, one of the most common heresies were people denying that the Eucharist truly was the flesh of Christ. St. Ignatius is one of the many early church examples when Protestants who begin to really dive deep into studying theology and church history, they're confronted with people like St. Ignatius of Antioch. And again, they have to ask themselves the question, St. Ignatius of Antioch believed in the Eucharist and all these other Catholic things, and so did all the other early church fathers. Is it really possible that my modern church denomination is correct and all those people were wrong? St. Ignatius is one of the most strongest examples of that. So we look for inspiration for him today. But also I wanted to say just a few words about this first reading today we had from St. Paul to the Ephesians. This letter from St. Paul to the Ephesians, especially chapter 2 here, this is a verse that maybe you might have encountered if you've ever been involved in any kind of intense theological or scriptural discussions with non-Catholic Christians. This is one of the famous verses that Protestants will point out to us as Catholics about salvation. We all know that there are many Protestant denominations that put a huge emphasis on accepting Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, and many modern Christian denominations believe that once you accept Jesus as your Savior, you are automatically going to heaven. There's no chance at all of losing it. I was confronted with this last week when I was at the Wabash Christian Men Bible Study. I was kind of surprised that virtually every single one of them basically took it for granted, that once you accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, right, you will be saved. You will automatically go to heaven, and there's no way of losing it. And one of the things that many Protestants think about us as Catholics is that Catholics, we believe that we save ourselves, right? We have this emphasis on doing good works throughout our lives, whereas Protestants tend to put the emphasis on just trusting in the grace of Christ. Right? And they will point to this passage from Ephesians, because Ephesians 2, verse 8 says this: "By grace you have been saved through faith. It is not from works, so that no one may boast." Say that again. "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and it is not from works, that no one may boast." Many Protestants read this passage and they see, you Catholics, you put all this emphasis on good works. St. Paul says it himself. You're not saved by works, but you're saved by grace through faith. And it might throw you off if you're ever thrown this verse, right? It's important for us to understand what we actually believe as Catholics. It is a mistaken understanding to say that Catholics believe we are saved by our own good works. That is not true. It was a heresy in the 4th century called Pelagianism, and the Catholic Church condemned it all the way back in the 4th century. Don't ever let somebody convince you that Catholics believe that we save ourselves. We believe exactly what Protestants believe with that regard. We believe that it had not been for the death of Christ on the cross, it would literally have been impossible for us to have been saved and to ever get to heaven. But the other end of the spectrum that sometimes Protestants overlook is that just because we are saved by the grace of Christ doesn't mean that we can't ignore that grace that is given to us. It doesn't mean that we can't reject that grace. St. Paul himself, he says in the letter to the Philippians, he said, "Work out your salvation with fear and trembling." Or in 2 Corinthians, he says, "I myself, I pummel my body, lest I, after preaching to others, might become disqualified." St. Paul and all the other early Christians, even though they emphasize that we are saved by Christ, they also emphasize the reality of hell and that it is possible to be disqualified even after accepting Christ. There's also another modern heresy in our age, which is not taught by the Catholic Church, but unfortunately many Catholics actually believe. How many times do you hear people saying things like, well, in order to get to heaven, I just want to be a really good person, In funerals, for example, how often do you hear people say, well, this person, gosh, they were just such a great person. They were so good. I know that they're in heaven. And, they never went to church or anything, but, they're a good person. That is heresy. The only way to be saved is by the grace of Christ. It doesn't mean that somebody who is not a Catholic or is not a Christian is automatically going to hell, but it is the reality that we can't just expect that through our own good works, because somebody is a good person, they get to go to heaven. That's not what the Bible teaches. That's not what the Catholic Church teaches. But it's important for us to understand these distinctions so we don't ever get ourselves into trouble when we're having these conversations with non-Catholics.